FIFA-C, Week 2, Part 3. Ever since the Philippines was granted independence in 1946, instead of winning it through an anti-colonial war of resistance, its foreign policy has been criticized for its mendicancy to the United States, or for being dependent or neo-colonial. For its part, the Philippines has strived to escape the gravitational pull of its senior alliance partner, the United States, by joining, for example, the Asian African Conference in Bandung during the presidency of Magsaysay in 1955, or adopting an Asia First or turning east policy under Macapagal in the 1960s, and a neutral policy under Marcos in the 1970s. However, it was not until Marcos was ousted in February 1986 through a nationalistic mass movement that the idea of enshrining the concept of an independent foreign policy emerged, with a view to standing up to the United States and charting an independent course. And so, almost a year later, in February 1987, Filipinos ratified in a national plebiscite a new constitution which contained the following provisions as some of its most distinctive and important. And let me quote Article 2, Section 2. The Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy, adopts the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land, and adheres to the policy of peace, equality, justice. Article 2, Section 7. The state shall pursue an independent foreign policy. In its relations with other states, the paramount consideration shall be national sovereignty, territorial integrity, national interest, and the right to self-determination. So as you can see, the language used here is the legal obligation shall and not will. Every Filipino president since Corazon Aquino has paid lip service at least to this constitutional ideal, with some substantiating it more than others through a hedging strategy. Until Duterte, however, no president was able to get as much attention or even traction from such pronouncements. Former De La Salle University lecturer Richard Heydarian in 2017 listed 5 key elements for Duterte's success in this aspect. Number 1, his anti-establishment brand of populism. Number 2, the rapid concentration of power in Duterte's hands. Number 3, the lack of clear American commitment to the Philippines and the South China Sea. Number 4, China's willingness to offer the Philippines both maritime and economic concessions in exchange for Manila setting aside the arbitration issue. And number 5, Duterte's personalization of foreign policy. Some of these have already been discussed in either the articles that you have read, or perhaps in the earlier parts that I have recorded. To get a better grasp of the meaning of this policy, Nico Galang in 2017 quoted 3 elements enumerated by Philippine Ambassador Jose Santaromana. Its separation from the US, which is the first element, which means the retention of the alliance but a lessening of dependence on the United States. And the second element, improvement of ties with China, which is self-explanatory. And the third one is the improvement of relations with non-traditional partners like Russia, Japan, and India. Jaconia Louis Dreisbach in 2020 says, however, that there is no definite document that clearly outlines what Duterte means by having an independent foreign policy. However, the president has given indeed ad hoc remarks or off-the-cuff remarks to that effect in his speeches and has taken a number of actions favoring China throughout the first 4 years of his term. Foreign Secretary Teodoro L. Locsin, who has interpreted this independence as meaning friends to friends, enemy to enemies, and a worse enemy to false friends, has threatened to recall ambassadors or break diplomatic relations over perceived slights, such as when Canada refused to take back its mislabeled hazardous waste in April 2019, or to refuse to receive aid from various donors, such as when 18 out of 47 member countries of the UN Human Rights Council backed an Iceland-proposed resolution in July 2019 to investigate the Philippines' human rights situation. However, the Philippines' threat to retaliate could also sound sometimes inconsequential and petty, such as when the DFA instructed its diplomats overseas not to attend diplomatic receptions of the countries involved in the Iceland resolution. Or sometimes, the threat that we make, sometimes we just walk back from it. Just like when President Duterte made a threat in January 2020 to end the Visiting Forces Agreement, or the VFA. Of course, we know what happened to that. In August, Secretary Locsin suspended the termination for 6 months, of course, with a clear possibility for an extension. In hindsight, it might seem now that Duterte's foreign policy of supposedly independent and different from all his predecessors rings hollow. However, I have to say that based on professional experience, many countries appear to take his pronouncements seriously in the beginning, and that provided a lot of openings for us to explore and pursue with our different foreign partners. In an earlier video, I had referred to the 3 pillars of foreign policy, or Filipino foreign policy, something that perhaps even members of the public, or of course students who are taking FIFOC for the first time, might know about. In any case, let me take this opportunity to explain this key concept of Philippine foreign policy. 2 of the pillars relating to national security and economic growth are actually some of the fundamental functions of the foreign policy of any country, including the Philippines. For instance, in an article that President Magsaysay wrote just 10 years after independence in the American International Relations magazine, Foreign Affairs, and this was in October 1956, he named 3 considerations that shaped Philippine foreign policy. First, national security. Second, economic stability. And third, political and cultural relations with the free world. Fast forward a couple of decades, all of this would change. In the 1970s, the confluence of high unemployment and poor economic development in the Philippines, as well as high demand for migrant labor in the Middle East, resulting from the Arab oil boycott in 1973, prompted then-President Marcos to approve the Labor Code of the Philippines the following year in 1974, which essentially established a governmental framework for overseas employment. I think this was described in the De Castro article that you downloaded last week. Apart from addressing the high unemployment rate, strengthening the country's balance of payments and reduction of poverty through remittances transformed what was initially a stopgap policy conceived by President Marcos into a more permanent one. By the late 1980s, the remittances from overseas Filipino workers had grown to such an extent and contributed to the economy significantly that the protection of the welfare of these workers became a policy necessity. And so, the Philippine Congress passed Republic Act number 7157, otherwise known as the Philippine Foreign Service Act in 1991, which gives a mandate to the Department of Foreign Affairs to implement the 3 pillars of Philippine foreign policy. These 3 pillars are as follows. Number 1, preservation and enhancement of national security. Number 2, promotion and attainment of economic security. Number 3, protection of the rights and promotion of the welfare and interest of Filipinos overseas. These 3 pillars are so central to Philippine foreign policy that they cannot be considered apart from each other, and almost any action taken by the Philippines overseas can be explained or rationalized by these 3 pillars. While the first 2, namely preservation and enhancement of national security and promotion and attainment of economic security, are a bit more conventional and easy to parse, the third one, protection of the rights and promotion of the welfare and interests of Filipinos overseas may not be so obvious if viewed from the foreign policies of more developed countries. Indeed, the kind of assistance provided by Philippine missions abroad to its nationals on almost any part of the migration process is unparalleled in the experience of any country. For example, the Philippine government lends its strength and expertise in seeking and concluding bilateral and multilateral arrangements for the protection of Filipino workers, especially in terms of improved and humane working conditions, security, appropriate compensation, and equitable benefits that nationals of other countries can only look on in envy. The Philippines also spearheads efforts geared towards placing issues on the protection and welfare of migrant workers in the agenda of regional and international fora. After signing the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families in 1990, the Philippines helped campaign for it to reach the threshold 20 ratifications in 2003 when it finally entered into force. Another example, the Philippines also worked for the overwhelming adoption by 152 states in December 2018 of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which is called, in short, GCM, which aims to enhance protections in all dimensions of international migration in a holistic and comprehensive manner. On the ground, 95 Philippine embassies and consulates are trained as part of their mission to provide assistance to nationals in trouble, regardless of status, through its ATN programs, as well as finance legal processes through its Legal Assistance Fund. The DFA continually assesses its processes to facilitate every aspect not only of the Filipinos' right to seek work overseas, but also the right to travel, opening passport centers in shopping malls, for example, as well as easing the documentary authentication process in the way the Philippines acceded to the Hague Apostille Convention of 1965. So as you can see, there are many more aspects of this third pillar, such as overseas voting and dual citizenship, that we will discuss in the future.